Welcome to this test review and problem solution video for questions that are based on the market forces of supply and demand. We're going to go through about 12 different slides. Some are just quick review slides and some will actually have sample test questions and how to handle those. So let's get started. We're going to start with sort of 4 easy questions, things that you're probably going to see on your test in some format. Either a short answer, multiple choice, a whole bunch of different ways, but basically it's the same thing. They're going to give you a chart. They're going to start asking you questions about this chart. So the first thing I always do is I go ahead and make myself a total line, because as we can see that this is about 4 families buying, and we're talking about supply and demand. We're talking about the market. And the other reason I make this line is I cannot tell you how many times I have watched students add something up and then boom, their eye slips up here to 10 instead of 6 and they have the wrong number. By simply doing this before you even see what the question is, you'll be less likely to have your eye slip. And you knew the concept, you just added up wrong. And because you're nervous, that happens. So a question might be, what would be the total market demand of the 4 families if OJ is selling at $3? And all you're going to do is make your eye go out there. So you've already figured that out. So you know it's 40 gallons. Now, what happens if there's a change from $3 to $4? How is that going to change things? Again, we just go up here, we take a look, here's our $3 mark, here's our $4 mark, and we can see that there is a change. It's basically going to drop by 10 gallons. Now, there's a ton of different questions they could ask you from this, and every time I look at the test bank, there's like 15 or 20 questions that are based on a chart like this. I've seen things like, what if the Miller family does not buy orange juice when it's $3 a gallon? How does that change total market demand? Well, they're buying 10 gallons normally if they're not going to buy it, so go from 40 to 30. What would be the market demand if we were to have the price per gallon $2 and 3 weeks later it's $4? You know, there's all kinds of things like this. What if sales price went down from one week to another? We went from $5 to $4. All it's asking you to do is be able to find your numbers and do simple addition and subtraction. The big trick with these is make sure you understand what they're asking and how many people. So notice it says 4 families here to make sure that they're not skipping out on someone. Sometimes I think these are, I call them a little tricky. Not tricky because they're hard to figure out, but because if you don't read it right, if you don't get all the little detail, then you go down the wrong direction. I've seen where sometimes faculty will have 3 or 4 questions in a row about a chart like this, and it's always about 4 families. And then the next one, it's about 3 families. And the poor student is thinking 4 families and comes up with what they are certain is the right answer, but it was really talking about 3 families. So watch for those slight shifts in conversations. You're also going to see charts like this when we're talking about specific sellers, and you're going to do the same thing. Make yourself a little total. Now, in this case, we're talking about cases. So make sure you understand we're talking about cases now. And you're going to see the same type of question. So what is the market quantity supplied for the entire market at $6? Now again, entire market. So here we go. It's going to be 600 because that's what our little thing added up to be. You know, what if only Tropicana supplied at $3? How many cases would be supplied into the market? So here's when we go $3, here's Tropicana, here's your answer right there, and of course it's 40 cases. There can be a ton of little questions like this thrown out about these charts. So really the big thing is make sure you know what they're asking. So like this one's just Tropicana, this is about the market quantity. And I tell you, the 2 seconds it takes you to do that will save you a lot. For one thing is that you know that this has got to be going up or going down. Simple questions. And remember, we like even numbers because we're not the big mathematicians. So if I was doing this and I went from 50 to 30 to 40 to 20, I'd go, wait a minute, something's wrong. That's probably not right. You're probably going to see numbers going up or going down. There can also be harder questions asked off of a chart like this. And one of the things that I tend to see in the supply and demand chapter test bank is that they suddenly start using letters that you haven't seen in your textbook. And an instructor may or may not catch that. If they just throw the whole test bank in there, and say, oh, answer X amount of questions from the test bank, and they throw these letters in there, it can be a little confusing at first. So let's talk about what they are. Well, you're going to do the same thing as we've done before. We're going to go ahead and make that last column, but notice this time I labeled the last column QS. All that means is quantity supplied. So this is what QS would be, 300, 600, 900 at these prices. So at the price of 3, the quantity supplied would be 300. Same thing, but letters. But then they throw a question like this out. And if you haven't seen what QS is, at first, this could really be confusing. So they're saying, what does quantity supply equal? Basically, what they're asking is for the function of the market supply. The function of market supply is basically going down to the basic per item. So in this case, we're doing per case. So we've got 300 cases. It's asking how much per case would the quantity supply be? Right now, it's really, really simple because we don't have many factors to look at. The only factor we really have is price and quantity. Now, later on, as things get a little bit more complex, you might have labor costs and all kinds of other costs to throw in. But in this early chapter, it's basically just going to be price and quantity. So how are we going to figure that out? Well, the answer is 100p. Basically, it's the number of cases divided by the price. So it's going to be 100p. If you'll notice, every single time, if we multiply 100 times 6, we're going to get 600. If we multiply 100 times 9, we're going to get 900. So that's pretty simple, except for the fact that you have to not be worried when you see QS. That just means quantity supplied. So keeping with those fun little letters, you could get something like this, where they say, basically, here's QD. QD is equal to 1,000 minus 100p, where QD is quantity and P is price. What is the equilibrium price? And again, I have watched students' eyes glaze over. Not as hard as it looks again. If this is quantity supplied, hopefully you guess this is quantity demanded. And P will stand for price. So what they're saying is they're going to give you a formula for quantity demanded is going to be 1,000 minus 100 times P. Well, we know what P is. This is P over here. This is price. So if QD is the quantity demanded and P is the price, what is the equilibrium price? And assume there's only these 4 sellers. Well, this is going to take a little bit of math. So the answer is going to be $5, but how are we going to get that? What we're looking for is that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. So if QD is $3, so we go with the $3 one first, we've been told that QD equals 1,000 minus 100 times 3 because P is $3 and that means it's going to be 700. QD is 700. Yeah, that's 300 minus that, that's 700. But the QS right here is not the same. Remember, supplied and demand have to be the same. So this cannot be the right answer. So I jump down to my next one. QD is $6. That would make that QD is 400 and QS is 600. So again, not the same, so it can't be it. But I do know it's somewhere in between this because this one was larger, this one was smaller. So we come in at $5. And now we say QD is 1,000 minus 100 times 5. So QD is 500. 5 times 100 is 500 minus 1,000 is 500. And QS would be 500. How do we know that? Because we already learned up here that P equals 100. Also, they told you here 100 times P. So that's 500. They're both the same. So this is the correct answer. The correct answer would be $5. You're looking for something that is the same as what that question is asking you. Now, assume that these are 4 sellers. The market price is determined to be this. We've seen this before. Now they're asking you, what is the quantity demanded at equilibrium? Well, we already figured that out, didn't we? We figured it out right here. Because we already know what the equilibrium price is. So by doing this little scenario, we already figured out it's going to be 500 cases. It doesn't matter if they ask you which question first. They ask you this question or they ask you this question first. You're going to do this little formula because you see it's the same little formula over here. So just write it out on paper and make sure you take your time to get your math right. That's why I say bring scrap paper and a little calculator. Now, assume that, again, these are the only 4 sellers. We've got the same little sort of formula here, and where QD is the quantity, P is the price. The current price is $6 per case. $6 per case. Well, we already figured out the $6. Is there a shortage or a surplus? Well, the demand is 400. The supply is 600. So we're going to have a shortage or a surplus. Well, that means that the sellers are making more than is demanded, so we're going to have a surplus. And the next question would be, how big is the shortage or surplus? Well, again, not too hard. We know the surplus is 600. We know the demand is 400, so 400 minus 600 is going to be 200. So the surplus is 200 cases because we're supplying 600, but the demand is only 400. Don't let the letters fool you. Don't let the letters toss you off. I can't tell you if this is exactly the question you're going to get, but the big thing is to remember QD is demand, QS is supply, and if they give you something like this, they're telling you how to calculate the demand. Now, there is also the way you could chart this out. That takes a little longer, but a lot of times they want to see the math. So I present you this, take a look at it, kind of practice a few of them, and let's move on to another one. So this chapter introduced demand, supply, and then it looked at both of them. So let's quickly cover demand as far as the type of questions you're going to have. What you're going to be expected to know is this information that's on the slide. So the biggest problem that we have with students are generally the income questions and the price related questions. They don't get substitute and complementary. The biggest suggestion I have for this one is that you've got to come up with examples in your head. So for me, for substitute products, I always think of beef and chicken. If I go to the store and beef is very expensive, I'm going to buy chicken. If chicken is very expensive, I'm going to buy beef. They're substitutable for me. Where complementary product for me is always peanut butter and jelly. I'm not buying jelly if I'm not buying peanut butter. I'm not buying peanut butter if I'm not buying jelly. So if the price of peanut butter goes up, I'm going to be buying less jelly. But if the price of jelly goes down, I might be buying more peanut butter. The reason I say if you come up with something that's in your head that represents what you think of, maybe substitutable is broccoli and cauliflower. Then when you get a question when they're asking you about substitute, instead of trying to work with the products they have, especially if they're not products you're familiar with, laptops and computer cables, those might be complementary, or they sure aren't substitutable because you can't substitute a cable for a computer. So you know it's complementary, and then all of a sudden I'm going to put my peanut butter and jelly in there instead of the laptop and computer cables. Or maybe if they're talking about something like an iPad versus a cell phone. Well, those might be substitutable for each other depending on what it is I want to do. So instead of thinking about iPads and phones, I go, okay, well, I'll think of beef and chicken. I'll put that in there instead. That can really help you sometimes when the questions may be about products you're not as familiar with. The same thing back here with income. Your big trick here is, again, is to have something in your head, an example that you can look at the question and base it upon. So I always find inferior goods a little bit easier to do. For me, it's taking the bus versus driving the car. Taking the bus to me is an inferior process than taking the car, at least where I live. And so if my income goes up, I'm going to be driving my car. If my income goes down, I'm going to be taking the bus. Or over here with normal goods, these are things that are sort of related to each other. And so for me, it's vacations. As my income goes up, I'm going to demand more vacations. As my income goes down, I'm going to go on less vacations. So if you can come up with examples for these and have them in your head, then when questions are asked, it's going to be a little bit easier. The other thing is to remember that this is about demand. So if you get questions that ask you about this, but they're talking about supply, then you know that's probably not going to be the right answer. And they love to give you 4 choices, and 2 of them are supply and 2 of them are demand, and you can instantly eliminate 2 of them because they have nothing to do with the question. The other thing is make sure you have these words down because this is how they're going to refer to it. So a shift is always going to be a change in demand, whereas movement along the demand curve is always going to be a change in quantity demanded. And the other thing is to basically just get that law of demand in your head. You got the law of demand in your head, you're going to be okay. So let's go on and look at just a dozen or so kind of multiple choice questions they might ask you and see how well you can do on them. So I'm just going to toss a bunch of questions out there that would normally be presented to you in multiple choice form, and you would have to look through the 4 selections and select the first one that you think is correct, and hopefully you would get it right. So let's just go through some just to see how well you basically can recognize the answers. So if candy rose from $1 to $1.50, a consumer would purchase less. Which law is this? Hopefully you got this right because we just did it. It's the law of demand. So a rightward shift of the demand curve is called a what? So we're talking about we have a curve and it's shifting this way. So we've here, now we're going here. That would be, according to the chart we just saw, an increase in demand. If the demand curve for candy saw movement along the curve, now your key here is along the curve. So we're not talking about shifting this way or shifting that way. We're talking about going up and down. What causes a shift along the curve? A change in price. When the quantity demanded for candy decreases at every point, what has happened to the demand curve? So we've got this curve that's right here, and everything is going this way, every price point. So we're going to have a new line, which means we have had a shift to the left. If peanut butter and jelly are complements, what would increase the demand for jelly? Well, why would I want to buy more jelly? Well, because I want to buy more peanut butter. But why would I want to buy more peanut butter? Well, the price of peanut butter went down because we are talking about the law of demand. We know it's a law of demand because we're talking about consumers, and consumers are about demand. So that means is that there has to be a decrease in the price of peanut butter. If the candy bars and cupcakes are substitutable, a higher price for cupcakes would result in what? Now here's a good example of where I might look at these two items and go, oh God, I don't know. I like them both, or I don't like candy. I would just change and say, okay, if the price of beef and chicken are substitutable, a higher price in chicken would result in basically me wanting more beef. So that's a great example of where I might change the items in my head so that I could go ahead and find the right answer. If the candy price was on sale at $1.50, but now it's $1 and consumers are purchasing more, which law is this? Again, we're talking about demand. Now this is basically the opposite of what the first one was. The first one, the prices were going up and people buying less. And this one, there's an example of prices going down and consumers are buying more. The other thing you're going to see is a chart presented to you. Now in this case, this is a chart that actually comes directly from the test bank. All I did was add a few dots and letters because, well, I didn't have room for 2 charts. So let's take a look at some questions they might ask you off of a chart like this. So if the income decreases and candy bar is an inferior good, so right here, this is one of the big keys. It is an inferior good. Now, if it's inferior good, that means that basically income and the good are going to go in opposite directions. So if we go back to our X and Y, if one is going up, the other one is going this way, or in this case, we say income is going down. This one's going to go that way. So we would have to kind of look at this and say, well, which ones of these lines, we're going to get rid of that one on you, is correct? Well, the income is decreasing. So in this one, this would be price increasing. So in this case, income is going down. Which way is the inferior going? It's going up. So if I look at this, the only one where I see movement going this direction is going to be from D to A. And guess what? If I can erase things, that is the correct answer. So we're shifting from A to B. The other way you can remember is that inferior good is going to move in the opposite direction of income. So if income is decreasing, the inferior good is going to be increasing. If the demand curve for candy shifts from DA to DB, what has occurred to price? Every single one, we see a shift from one to the other. So what has occurred in price? Well, the price of the candy has risen at every demand point. People are willing to pay more for the candy. Now, you might go back and go, hey, wait a minute, this seems like one I already saw before. Right, because over here I had it the opposite direction. I had the candy was decreasing at every point. Here we have it that it is increasing at every point. So same basic question, but one time with a chart and one time without a chart. If the sale of the candy bar increases the price from O, would demand move from to J or M? Now this is a pretty common question too, and it's also like one we've already had. So we have to kind of think about this for a second. We're here, but we're talking about the seller. Here's your key, the seller. If the seller is increasing the price, is the seller the consumer? No. So in order for us to shift or jump to the line, it'd have to be about consumers. And since it's not, it's about the seller, it's got to be on the same line. So it's a movement question, which means basically it's going to move to J. It's movement along the curve. And the last one, the shift from DA-DB would be called what? An increase in demand, which is just like question number 2. So you can see they can ask you the same questions, but one time they may ask it in just a straight, here are your 4 choices. Another time they may be presenting you a chart, but basically the same question. So let's go on and look at supply. So like demand, there are going to be questions on supply that are very similar to what we just saw. The big difference here is the things that shift supply. And remember, supply is all about the seller. So we're talking about producing items. So in the very beginning of this lecture, we saw that there were more complicated questions with supply than there was perhaps with the consumer. Sort of the same thing here. You might have a little bit more complex. The big thing is about input prices. And so you have to remember that if input prices go up, production costs go up, and then supply may be reduced. So if input prices go down, production cost goes down, and supply can increase. The big thing to remember here is that unlike the other one, this is a positive slope. So as one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. They're going to go in the same direction. And so if there's more sellers, there's more supply. If there's less sellers, there's less supply. Again, we've got our law of supply over here. You'll see questions like that. And we have our 2 key kind of ways they refer to things. So let's jump into some questions like we just did with demand. So let's see how you do on supply questions. This is a lot like the demand questions, and these are the most popular questions that I see out there. So an increase in the price of goods would see what type of movement on the supply curve? We'd see along the curve because we're talking about the price of the good. When the price of a good falls, if all things are equal, the quantity supplied of goods would decrease because prices fall, we're going to make less things. Why does the supply curve slope upward? Which is a really good question. It's because as prices increase, sellers want to produce more. There's an incentive to produce. Assume that the price of a good is currently $5 and the seller makes 10. The price of the good goes up to $10 next week. How will the seller most likely respond? And I've seen a couple of questions that are sort of in this vein. They ask it a couple of different ways. Basically, they're going to want to produce more than 10 items. Sometimes they literally will list and say, what will they most likely produce? And they'll give you 2, 3, 4, 6, 12. And they'd want to do 12 because that's more than 10. Sometimes they'll have an answer like this. Sometimes they'll say there'd be incentive to produce more. So it's a kind of a common question that has 3 or 4 different ways that they could present that particular one. When the quantity supply decreases at every possible price, the supply curve has done what? Now we saw the same one with demand, but now we're thinking about the supply curve. So remember, the supply curve is going up like this, and so the price is decreasing at every point. So we have to have a shift, and it's going to be a shift to the left. To find the total amount supplied in a market for a particular price point, what must we do? Well, the big key here is that we're saying a particular price point, and we're saying the market. So we're not looking at the individual, we're looking at the whole. That means that we have to add up all the supplies that firms and here's your big key here, are willing and able to supply. So I've seen questions where they have the same answer and they'll put that all firms are able to supply or all firms are willing to supply, but they don't have willing and able. They'll have 4 questions and they'll say, or all of the above. It's got to be willing and able. That's your big sort of trick to that question. What happens to the supply curve if there's a significant increase in the cost of cocoa needing to make candy bars? So we're talking about an increase in input, and of course the curve would shift to the left because they're going to pass that along. Candy maker bought a new faster machine. What most like happened to their supply curve? Well, it's going to shift to the right because we've got a lower cost of production. We might be able to lower our prices. Due to recent forest fires, there's less trees to harvest, and lumber prices will most likely rise. This could cause what to occur in the current supply. So here one of the things is they're asking about the current supply, not the one in the future. Sometimes I see this written that something is going to happen now and in 6 months they know something's going to happen. Basically this is your expectation question, and basically the supply of lumber is going to fall now as builders want to buy up the stock, and the price is going to rise as the supply decreases. So you can see a couple of different answers to that one too. As more countries discover oil reserves and refine it to gasoline, gasoline supply curve will do what? Well, this is the last one of those 4. So we have an increase in suppliers. We're going to have a shift to the right because we're going to have an increase in the number of units, you might want to say, that can be supplied. And so here's another kind of one that they see a lot. As the streaming music has become more popular, CD records have fallen. Which is most likely to happen as a result? And the key there is most likely. And again, we're thinking economics terms. So are we going to have more firms entering the market due to a higher price? Well, no, because there's going to be less demand. So why would there be more people? The cost of making CDs increase. Well, we don't know about that because it doesn't say anything about the cost of CDs becoming more important. And would it be all the above? Well, we can eliminate this one because we have nothing about the cost. So there's only one, which is the supply of CDs would decrease. Why? Because there's going to be less firms making them, and if there's less firms making it, then there's going to be less supply. Now I'm going to move over to the next slide where I have a bunch of charts, and they just simply didn't fit on this page, but they're also about supply. So let's look at some of the examples of charts and graphs they may present you and questions based on that. Here's an example of some charts you might see. Now I've doctored these just a little bit. Generally they won't have these 2 points on there, and they wouldn't have these 3 lines. There are diagrams that have just the 3 lines or just the points, but they're not producer A, B. But again, I've just kind of condensed everything to make it fit on one slide. So let's look at some questions you might be asked looking at these charts. I was also trying to give you a minute to take a quick look at them. So if we have movement from point B to point A, so from B down to A, what does that show us? Well, there's a decrease in quantity supplied. We're on the same line, we're just going down, so it's a movement along the curve. What is the total market supplied at $2? So we've talked about this before, that in order to get the total market, because that's our question, total market, we need to know about all producers at $2. We got a price of 2 here, price of 2 here, 2 here, 4 here, so the answer would be 6 items. Again, I'm just trying to give you a second or two to see if you can figure out the answers yourself. At $8, which seller produces more items? And if you picked the correct one, you would have picked producer B, because you can see at $8, they're producing 16. This person at $8 is producing 8. So the movement from line S3 to S4 is called what? And that's an increase in supply. So if you remember a couple of slides back, I said it's really going to be important that you understand the names of these things, because on the next one I'm going to say, what is the movement from point B to point A called? And that's going to be an increase in quantity supplied. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth. I saw quite a few questions in the test bank that was really testing your ability to understand when you're going to use an increase in supply or an increase in demand or an increase in quantity supplied versus an increase in demand supplied. So remember, quantity is anytime you're going to be moving along the curve, and in simple increases when there's a shift. So it doesn't matter if it's supply or demand. If it's moving along, you've got the word quantity. Okay, so let's look at a couple other questions. So would a decrease or increase in the price of cocoa cause the supply curve to move from S2 to S4 if you're a candy bar maker? So we're moving from S2 to S4. Cocoa is needed to make candy bars, so let's see what you came up with. Hopefully a decrease in input costs. Why? Because we're shifting to the right, and so we're able to produce more, and we can produce more probably because our costs have gone down. Looking at producer A, so we're over here on producer A, if they could sell their product at $12, what is the most likely quantity they would produce at? So you could see this in a chart form, you could see this in a table form, but basically they're just asking to see if you could figure this out. And of course, the answer would be 12 units. If you'll notice, it's going up by 2 units every time, and the price and the quantity are the same each time. So since we know it's 12, it's going to be 12. Which is an example of quantity supplied increasing at every possible point? A shift from S2 to S3 or from S4 to S3? So we're talking about going this way or going this way. Sorry for the little cough there, but dry voice. And if you figured it out, we're looking for a right shift, and the right shift is from S2 to S3. And here's your final question. Is it an increase or decrease in cocoa causing the supply curve to move from S4 to S3? So we have got a left shift, and what is happening? We have an increase in input costs. So I hope those helped you. We're going to move on to another type of question altogether. So just a quick reminder from the lecture on these particular items, we're going to be looking at problems that will now look at equilibrium. So remember, equilibrium is that point in the middle where the two supply and demand curves come together. Equilibrium price is going to be the price that we're willing to pay at that point. Equilibrium quality is the amount that we're willing to purchase and supply at that point. Remember, surplus happens when we have basically more supply than we have demand. And so we have a surplus, and shortage is where we have more demand than we have supply. We also want to make sure we remember the 3 steps to analyzing and the law of supply and demand. This is just a quick reminder of graphically how you're going to see the shifts occur when you've got both supply and demand. Here you've got your shift in demand. Here you've got a shift in supply. Here you've got a shift in demand and supply. Now, as you look at these quickly, remember that this is only going one direction. So if I was to go the other direction, you would see the price going down and the quantity going down. What's important to remember is that on demand shifts, both price and quantity are going to go in the same direction. On supply shifts, price and quantity are going to go in different directions. And then when you have both supply and demand shifts, you got a little bit of everything happening there. If you've never seen this chart before, you probably want to write this chart down. It helps you a great deal to kind of remember how things are going. As I explained in my lecture, increase, up, or higher, they're all the same thing. It's just that I see all 3 of these words being put into test questions, and so I just don't want people to get confused. When I say no set outcome, this primarily means is that it's not always a decrease. Sometimes it's an increase. Sometimes there's no change at all. So what this just simply means is that I can't say there's only going to be this. Whereas with this one, when we talk about no change in supply, but always an increase in demand, we're always going to see both of them going the same direction. Whereas if we see no change in demand, but we see an increase in supply, we're always going to see opposite directions. So anytime you see no set outcome right here, it simply means is that I can't tell you that it's always going to be rising or it's always going to be lowering or it's always going to be the same. It would depend on the numbers. So make sure you just give a good kind of quick review. You have those in your head as you go through your test. You might even want to sort of make that chart for yourself as you move forward. So let's look at some test questions that would be about these shifts when we're talking about supply and demand. So here's a chart you saw at the beginning of the video, and we're going to come back and play with this chart. Why? Because basically in the test banks, they only create a couple of charts and then they like to ask lots of questions off those charts. And depending on how your instructor picks questions, if they're using the test bank, they're more than likely to pick several questions off of one chart. Since we know that there may be several questions off of one chart, we're going to go ahead and do that total because it's going to make life so much easier if we just have that there. So here's our first question. Let's just say that we're asking what the quantity supply changes if it changes by 3. Well, make sure you don't miss a very important part of this question. Florida's nature and Joe Trader is all they're looking for. They're not asking for the other ones. And so I have students sometimes who'll come right over here and they'll start saying, well, it's 300. And they'll pick 300 out of the multiple choice questions because they miss that we're only asking for these two, which means that we're looking for this information and we're looking for this information. So if you've done this, you should have already figured out it's 200 cases. Why? Because if we look at $3 each, they're each going to supply 100 at $3. So it's a total of 200, a total of 400, a total of 600. 2 from 4 is 2, 4 from this is 2, and there you've got your answer. It's not as hard as it looks, but the big thing is just make sure you know what they're asking for. So if you'll notice, I've just popped in a new little table, and you could see a lot of questions that have a demand table added with it along with the supply table. Because remember, in the later part of this particular lecture or this chapter, you're starting to combine demand and supply together. So in this next question, this is looking at the two tables. What is the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity? Now, this is a lot easier than it first looks because we have to remember equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity is where suppliers will supply at a level that demand will buy, and it has to be the same numbers. So at $6, they will supply 600, and over here in demand at $6, they will buy 600. So we have 6 and 6, that equals. So basically, we've got $6 and 600. Nothing you had to calculate, which is always nice not to have to calculate. So based on supply table, will the market be in equilibrium at $5? Now, I see this question asked in multiple different ways, such as which one below would be the equilibrium price? How much would be the equilibrium quantity? We solved this at the very beginning of this video, but they could re-ask this question in multiple ways. So of course the answer is yes, and if you've forgotten how we solved that, go back to, and I say we being you and me, go back to the beginning of the video and just take a quick rewatch of that one. But there's 4 or 5 different ways they could ask that question. Now another popular chart you get is sort of a demand chart with price on it. And again, I'm going to go ahead and figure out what the totals are. But notice this time, since I have an X here, I don't know what this total is. It's 3 plus X. I put that there to remind myself that if they're asking for the market demand, I'm going to have to add in 3 plus whatever they tell me X is. So let's look at the first question. If X is 1, whose demand curves are similar? So in this case, all they're asking you to do is to replace this X with a 1. And so we've got 3 and 1 with Neil, 3 and 1 with William. So the two people who have basically similar demand curves are Neil and William. Now, you may say to me, why is she wasting my time with this question? You would be surprised at how many of the top students will get this wrong. Why do they get it wrong? Because it looks too easy. And they think there's a trick somewhere in here. Make sure that when you hit a question that looks this easy, understand it probably is that easy. Why? Because when tests are developed by instructors, we have to put in some easy questions. There have to be some questions that a D student could pass. They could get it right. There have to be some questions that a C student could pass. There have to be some questions that a B student could pass. An A student should be able to pass all those questions plus the A questions. So yes, there are going to be some very easy questions probably tossed into your test. Don't think it's a trick. It's really because an instructor has to put in a few easy questions to ensure that a D student could get it right to prove that they are below average, that they're not at the average level. So you'd be surprised at how often I get students miss some of these really easy ones or are good students because they think there's a trick. No trick. So whose demand conforms to the law of demand? Now, this is kind of a neat way to basically test your ability to understand the law of demand. I've also seen this where you've gotten a chart like up here, and they'll say which company is like the law of supply. You also have seen them where I say which one is not like the law of demand, is not conforming. So it's multiple different questions asking the same thing. So in this case, we know that both Neil and Brandon are basically meeting the law of demand because as prices went up, their quantity went down. They could also do one where they say, what if X was 4? Who is not meeting the law of demand? Who's purchasing doesn't seem to fit the law of demand, and then that would be William because his demand went up even though price went up. And of course the law of demand says that as prices go up, demand should go down. So there's a couple of different ways you can see that one pop in. Same basic thing, reworded different ways. If X is 2, what is the slope of William's demand curve and what is the slope of the market demand curve? So we're going to have to figure out two different demand curves. And here we've got X is now 2. So we're going to put a 2 in there and we're going to put a 2 in here. So the market demand is going to be 5. William's demand is going to be 2 here. Well, if you've forgotten how to do a demand curve, let's take a look at it. First of all, there's the correct answer. Demand curves are pretty simple, but if you've forgotten how, I have that video on how to do graphing, and at the end of the graphing one, it also has how to calculate slope. And what we need to remember is that we're going to have two coordinate pairs. And so the first coordinate pair that we have for William is the price of $3 and the demand of 3. And the second coordinate pair is going to be a price of $5 and the demand of 2. Why? Because we said X is 2. Now you may say, but I've got these in a different direction. Well, it's because we have to remember that our little chart, we've got P over here, we've got Q over here, and this is your X, and this is your Y. And our coordinate pairs are always X, comma, Y. So we need our coordinate pairs, which they've given us. And now all we're going to do is do our rise over run, the rise over run. And we get -2 over 1. And of course, you know, if you divide 1 into -2, it's going to be -2. So that's why William is -2. We do the same thing now with the market, except for that our numbers are slightly different here for the X because we're using these numbers. So it's the same thing, but it's going to be -2 over 5. So rise over run. And again, if you need a little help with that, just go back and watch the graphing video. The next question is basically going to have you look at X as being 2, the current price is 5, quantity supplied is 10. Now notice we don't have a chart on quantity supply. They're going to give this to you. Is there a shortage or a surplus? Well, we got to make sure we go to 5. And if we know that X is going to be 2, so we're going to replace this X with 2, that means that the market demand is 5, but they're only supplying, they're supplying 10. But the market demand is only 5, then we're basically going to have a surplus of 5 because demand is only 5. I hate it when it's exactly the same words, same number. So one of the things we also can notice on here, and I've seen them ask, is like what might be the result of that. And it would be that prices will have to fall because when we have basically a surplus, in order to sell that surplus, we're going to have to lower prices. Now here's another one that's going to involve slope. And in this case, we've got as X is 2. So we're already pretty well familiar with that. We've done that a couple of times. This time the current price is $3. and the amount supplied is $4, not 10. The amount supplied is 4, and our slope is 2. So remember, when we're talking about slope, we're talking about rise over run. So we're going to go up 2 and over 1. And since this is price, right, we're going to go up $2 and we're going to go over 1 item. How do we get 2 over 1? Because we know it's a 2, and that would be a 2 over 1. We just kind of forget the 1 because 1 divided into that is 2. So we know for every $2 we go up in price, we're going to add 1 item. So how do we calculate that out? Well, let's look at that. First of all, we know that demand at $3 is 10, but the supply is 4. They told us that. So we have a shortage of 6 items. So that's our first question. Is there a shortage of supply? There's a shortage of 6 items. What's going to be the equilibrium price? Well, we had to figure out what the demand is at 5. So we know that demand at 5 is going to be 5 items because it's 3 plus 2. So the slope, we already said, means that rise in 2, there's going to be an increase in 1 item. The current supply at $3 is 4 items. So if we rise by 2, that makes the items 5. The supply will go from 4 plus 1, because we're going up 1 item. That would make it to 5. So supply and demand are now equal. Supply price is 5. The quantity is 5. So a lot of the math isn't really hard, but it does come back to understanding basic slope. What you see are 2 pretty common graphic displays that you're going to see on your tests. I've actually pulled these off of these, modified them slightly. What I'm going to do in a moment is pop up a whole bunch of questions based on these 2 graphs. I'm then going to count to 3, and on 3 I will go ahead and show you the answers. What I'd recommend is after I pop up the questions, pause the video, answer as many as you can, and then see how many you got correct. 1, 2, 3. Here are the answers. I bet you got a ton of these correct, if not all of them. If not, go back and review a few things, maybe go back to the lecture, but I bet you got most right. And you're probably feeling pretty prepared for your test now. As usual, what I have presented is pretty much what you see on the test bank, but they are slightly altered. And I always recommend that you double check with your instructor to see what type of things they're asking you to know for your exams. I hope this helped you, and in the meantime, keep learning.